wanted to share a few ideas with you today of mostly a kind of analytical, conceptual sort of blueprint without getting into too many details. The more work you do in my field, and the older you get, the less you remember, so you stick to the conceptual because the facts get in the way and they're hard to retrieve and that sort of thing. So, but I am going to start with two sort of quick stories today that are going to illustrate the kind of problem or problematic that I want to talk about today in terms of not so much Islam in politics, but the role of Islamists as political groups and Islamist ideology in the broader context of the Arab Spring. And I would be happy, as Peter suggested, to bring into the discussion other places such as Iran, for example, or Indonesia, or places I visited and spent time in, but I will focus primarily on the Arab world. And the two stories I want to refer to are stories that came out literally in the last 2 days. One is the decision by the government of Tunisia to close Bourguiba Avenue to protest, a decision made yesterday in the wake of protests and counter-protests between Islamists and secularists that grew a little violent, the intervention of some of the security forces, the use of tear gas. Suddenly you had the sense that this was another time and another era, and not the one that you had expected from the new democratically elected government. And yet here was the government decided not so much to shut down all protests, because what they planned or promised to do was allow for protests in other parts of Tunis, and there are certainly other areas where such protests could take place, but Bourguiba has a particularly important symbolism in terms of one of the places where, after the revolution came from the hinterlands into the capital, this is where a lot of the energy was mobilized. So it's quite a decision by the government of the Nakhta party to decide that they would shut down this avenue for protests and use, if they had to, force to do so. Whether this is right or wrong, we can discuss. I'm not passing judgment. I'm simply alerting us to the fact that here, in the context of an escalating standoff between Islamists and secular forces, or defenders of a certain notion of secularism, we can talk about that as well. We had a democratically elected government forced to, or from its point of view, compelled by circumstances to intervene. So that is one story. And then across the pond, or it's not really the pond, but on the other side of the Mediterranean or close by, we have the story of Egypt and the decision by the administrative court today to essentially declare unconstitutional the procedures used by the parliament to elect and or appoint members, a 100-member constituent assembly whose job it is, or constitutional constituent assembly whose job it is to write the Constitution. And this court decision was taken as a consequence of a coalition of political actors led by secularists, but also members of Al-Azhar's ruling council and others, to go to the courts and use the courts as a mechanism to try to either declare the Constituent Assembly or the Constitutional Assembly unconstitutional and or force the Ikhwan Muslimin, the Muslim Brethren, and its political party to make concessions and allow for greater participation of non-Islamists in the writing of the new constitution. So this comes as a consequence, as in Tunisia, of the growing polarization between Islamists and secularists, and it's precisely why, when I was asked to talk about Islamists, I much more preferred to talk about the politics of identity conflict. I don't think that, depending on which country you're in the region, the issue is not Islam or Islamism versus something else, but what is going on is a process by which different constituencies with competing and sometimes conflicting notions of what democratic politics means are being brought to the fore by the very process of democracy. And in that conflict, we have sometimes a conflict between Islamists and non-Islamists or secularists, but sometimes we have a conflict between Shia and Sunni, sometimes we have a conflict between Kurds and Shia. I mean, in every country of the region, these sorts of identity conflicts differ, and therefore we can't reduce them to the issue of Islam or Islamism. Certainly the issue of Islamism is an important part of the equation, but it is not. I have an article some of you may have read, I published 2 or 3 years ago, time flies, called Islam is Not the Problem or the Solution, in which I argue that the context of the political context is much more important than Islam or Islamist itself, and I'm going to talk about that today. So we have in the region a series of identity conflicts that vary in terms of the particular cleavage we're talking about. And once again, it's not always about Islamists versus non-Islamists. Sometimes it's about Islamists versus Islamists. In Tunisia, it's clearly a very significant cleavage is between the Islamists and secularists, but between the Nakhta party and the Salafists, there is a growing cleavage there as well. So sometimes it's within the Islamist camp, sometimes it's a cleavage that is defined in sectarian terms. The Arab Sunni majority in Syria, the largely Alawite ruled regime in power there in Damascus. In Bahrain, we have a Sunni minority government imposing itself on majority Shia population. We can get into a discussion about the numbers there because they've changed over time, in part as a consequence of governmental policy. But these cleavages differ from place to place, and the challenge throughout the region is to see how and what ways these cleavages can be remedied through rather than against the democratic process. I'm sure that many of you here, if you study political science and comparative politics, are familiar with the literature on divided societies and the literature on problems of democratization in the context of conflicts in which identity, whether it's defined culturally, linguistically, ethnically, or some combination of that, coincides with political identity. In those kinds of environments, the challenge is to find a process that brings all the players in, so the message to those who assume or have fear that they might lose as a result of a democratic election, the message to those potential losers is that there's a process that is based on consensus and inclusion such that they will know that at the end of the day, the ballot will not punish them or exclude them, because where in fact democratization results in political exclusion as a consequence of the mandate itself or the perception of the possibility of exclusion, democracy becomes not a means of conflict resolution, but a path towards greater conflict. And that's the dilemma we face, I think, throughout the Middle East today. That is to say, we had the states in the region which essentially engaged in what I've called in my work protection racket politics, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But before I go to that question of protection racket politics, I just want to mention the kinds of approaches that I think are not useful for understanding what we're dealing with. I'm just not going to spend a lot of time in the straw man process, but I think that, generally speaking, I think that traditional Orientalism, the examination of Islam or Islamist notions of identity and trying to sort of root the problem in the nature of Islamic law, or tradition, or Sharia, those are not completely irrelevant, but I think we know very well based on the study of Islamists and politics. When we go to Indonesia, for example, we see the inclusion of Islam and Islamism in a democratic process in what is the most populist Islamic country in the world. We know from the experience of Indonesia, there's no way that we can argue that Islam or Islamism is itself an intrinsic impediment to democratization. And the notion that we're going to root the problem in Islam itself, I think, has been widely and justifiably discredited. That is a tradition which I've called in my work negative Orientalism. There is another kind of approach to Islam which I call positive Orientalism, and that is more ubiquitous than we might imagine, and I think more insidious. And that tradition says that Islam has its own cultural reference, has its own notion of democracy intrinsic to Islam itself, based on shura or ijma consensus, and therefore what is necessary and the only way to have democracy in the Arab world and Muslim world is to make sure that ultimately that form of Islam and the true identity of Islam prevail through the democratic process. We've seen various variations of this argument, including the notion that Islamism is intrinsically corporatist in its intellectual and ethical nature, or based on consensus, and it has its own version of Islam. And of course, many Islamists would readily make that argument themselves. I simply don't think that it gets us very far in explaining everything, or anything, or probably everything. Because if we look at the Middle East right now, we look at the actions of some Islamist parties, they certainly don't seem inclined towards consensus politics based on some sort of notion of Islamic authenticity. I just don't see that reading as persuasive. So I think positive Orientalism is also a dead end conceptually as well, because it really doesn't explain very much. It ultimately is the same as negative Orientalism, a form of cultural relativism, a kind of civilizational argument which says that they have their thing, which either explains autocracy or Islamic democracy, and we have our thing. And I think that's simply a misreading of what's going on in the region. I do think a much more persuasive understanding of what's going on is precisely to understand the political context and the institutional and political incentives, or absence thereof, that would get Islamists and other competing identity groups together around a democratic process so that they could define themselves, for themselves, a solution to this democratic paradox, which, as I alluded to before, is the paradox of democratization exacerbating rather than solving identity conflicts. And I think that the answer to that, I don't want to dismiss completely the importance of reinterpreting Islam or Islamic identity. I think a jump into pure rationalist analysis, let's call it that, in which it's all only about context, and context or economic interest. I don't want to be reductionist, to use a big social science term in that sense, because I do think that the process of rethinking Islam is not unimportant, but that takes place in a much larger political context, which I think really does matter, and against the background of state-building patterns which help or hinder the process of negotiations in ways that I don't have much time to talk about today, but we can talk about it in the question and answer section when we start perhaps roaming from place to place. But in any case, so I think the political context matters, and the context that I alluded to before is a context of protection racket states. And what do I mean by protection racket states? Protection racket states are authoritarian states which exist not merely through coercion, but by offering certain forms of economic and political and security protection to vulnerable minorities. They might be, for example, Christians in Syria or Christians in Iraq who are leaving in very large numbers in the wake of democratization there. They might be, in the case of Tunisia, the seculars, who are clearly an ideological minority, if you like. So the protection racket game, as it were, by which these states offer certain kinds of protections in return for the political loyalty, or at the very least the tacit support of these groups towards the state, varies from place to place. I do think that, in part, we can explain the heavily authoritarian orientation of states such as Syria and post or pre-invasion Iraq under Saddam Hussein, or even Bahrain. We can attribute the nature of that coercive state and the protection racket to the extent to which, from the vantage point of those in power, democratization is a zero-sum conflict that they can't possibly prevail in at any point because they are minorities, and if they open up the gate to full democratization, they'll be overwhelmed. From the vantage point of the Alawites in Syria, for example, and we see it today because look how the regime is behaving, there's no basis for a negotiated outcome other than the one that the regime talks about, which isn't a negotiation at all. From the point of view of this, from this regime, any process of real democratization jeopardizes the economic and political and social dominance of the minority. And not only that, opens up the possibilities of vengeance in the wake of a democratization process. We can see the same sort of dynamic unfolding in Iraq as Maliki and the Shias essentially are moving to take hegemonic control of the political apparatus and marginalize the Sunni minority and gain retribution for all those years of exclusion and persecution of the Shia. So I think that and from the vantage point of the government in Bahrain, a Sunni monarchy minority regime, democratization puts the Shia and their supposed enemies, the Iranians, in power. And I think that one of the interesting lessons about those examples is that that kind of cleavage is particularly difficult to negotiate a solution to. In some respects, I think the secular Islamist division is much less defined, offers a lot more room for negotiation, because it's largely an ideological, cultural, political divide that can be addressed. But when you have such clear-cut identity cleavages as you do in Syria or Bahrain or the emergence of those identity cleavages in the wake of democratization, because what democratization does, it creates a security dilemma. If the state is weak, even people who would rather not identify as this or that are forced to make choices. We saw that in Algeria in the 90s. And so the consequence is, strangely enough, democratization in weak states. And we now see that, for all the strength of Syria, it's a weak state. Remove the security apparatus and the place implodes. Yemen, too. So under those conditions, everybody is compelled to make choices. And that exacerbates the identity conflict and exacerbates the choices. And so in those countries, I think it's very hard to imagine. This is terribly pessimistic for somebody who works at the Institute of Peace, where conflict resolution is our bread and butter. But I think it's very hard to imagine a solution in Syria other than a military one in which the majority Sunni population essentially overthrows the Alawite minority regime. But we can get into that. In the context of the secular Islamist split, there, as I've suggested before, I think that the paradox, the dilemma of democratization is a little easier to resolve, but that is largely dependent on the nature of Islamism as a political movement, its own ideological traditions, the leadership of the movement, and it depends in part on the institutional balance of forces. And here there's an interesting contrast between the two cases that I started off talking about today, Egypt and Tunisia. In the case of Egypt, we had a military-led regime that was more or less at one with the security apparatus. And in the wake of the Tahrir protests, the military emerges as the arbiter of this conflict between secularists and Islamists, essentially. And in the beginning, each side accuses the other of butting up to the military. Both sides are trying to play the military against the other side. There's no question about it. Because that's where the power lies. The SCAF is using its institutional power and its resources and its capacity for coercion to try to draw in each side in these process of selective negotiations, trying as best as it can to pursue the same divide and rule strategy that had been part of the liberalized autocratic method in Egypt, and sort of replicate it. So what I've seen in Egypt for the last year is the effort to sort of, I think by the military, in a very improvisational way, to find ways to reinvent the old liberalized autocracy in a more sort of democratic and open context, but one in which the military is trying to sort of find ways to sustain its, not only its clear economic perks, because the military has a very important sort of roots in the economy, but also to use its institutional power to sort of play this divide and rule strategy and to, in that process, sustain its sort of influence. And that, of course, was manifest in the effort of the military to come up with a number of supra-constitutional principles that would have protected its interests and would have made sure that the Islamists would not become dominant in the new political system. And on that very effort, there was a major divide within the secular, liberal, leftist camp. Some of the secularists were very happy that the military played this card and others were not. And that division really helped to undermine the capacity of the secularists to negotiate with the Islamists and with the military at the same time. And so what you had is this very broken transition in which the military was acting and trying to create what I call a field of manipulation. One of the paradoxes, Peter, you mentioned liberalized autocracy, one of the paradoxes of liberalized autocracy is that the game was based on manipulation. And so all the openness that you had, or semi-openness, or controlled openness, whatever you wish to call it, becomes the arena of conflict in which the military is now sort of rejiggering the openness, and it creates a very sort of divided political field. And one thing we know from all studies of democratization, my colleague Mark Howard at Georgetown has done considerable work on this, where oppositions are divided, it doesn't necessarily matter if regimes are divided and weakened. Unless the opposition can join forces and come up with a clear shared agenda, you can lose the game, and the whole thing can fall apart. And this is the scary prospect in Egypt. I remain, by the way, convinced it's not going to, but there's a prospect that things could fall apart. I think things have gone too far for the military to reassert some sort of Turkish, old-style Turkish model in Egypt, but it could happen, and we'll see. So that's the Egypt case, where sort of the mechanism by which the Islamists, in a liberalized autocracy, the regime tries to be friends and enemies of everyone. That's how the game is played. So the regime, within the parameters of the regime and the ruling party in Egypt, there are camps that are close to the Islamists and camps that are close to the secularists, camps that are close to Al-Azhar, and the regime is trying to maintain its patronage relationships with all these groups and play them off one against the other. And sometimes it becomes a very Islamist regime, and sometimes it becomes a very secular regime. It all depends on where the threat is coming from. And that's how the game is played. So in the case of a liberalized autocracy model, pluralism is a necessary condition for this game. Some element of pluralism is necessary. And in a strange sort of way, we can say that that quasi-pluralistic heritage in Egypt has been really a problem in a kind of odd sort of way. And I haven't even talked about the xenophobic sort of campaign by the regime and so on against the NGOs and the Americans. I was there in the middle of that for a little while just recently. But we can get into that later. And then there's the Tunisian model, which is Tunisia was not a liberalized autocracy. It was a full autocracy. It was a despotism. It was Ben Ali and his clique and the Trabulsis and the hairdresser, you know the story, right? And his wife and the corruption and the ruling party, which was more kind of a Soviet-style patronage ruling party apparatus. And there, of course, there was a critical divide between the security apparatus and the military. In contrast to Egypt, where the two were essentially one, the military was professional, had nothing to do with the security apparatus, was trained and close to the United States, whereas the security apparatus was largely trained by the French and the Italians, by the way. So when the security apparatus turned on the protesters in the beginning of the revolution, the military stepped in and said, we're not going to have any of this, and forced Ben Ali out. And the regime, it didn't collapse overnight. There were several efforts to resuscitate elements of the old regime, and there were these protests on Bourguiba Street, one after the other, and eventually the thing collapsed, and we had what is much closer to a revolutionary transformation than anything else we've seen in the region. And the consequence of this was, and it was a good consequence, was there was no arbitering force. There wasn't a military to play one against the other. And the security apparatus, in contrast to the Egyptian military, had no experience in this game. I mean, it was a security apparatus that paid people off and beat them up, but it wasn't part of a larger military apparatus that had a political role. So once the security apparatus is essentially silenced in the Tunisian case, the Islamists and the secularists have to talk to each other. They have nowhere else to go. I mean, if they can't make peace, the thing will fall apart. And of course, what was encouraging about the process was how clearly Nahda understood that. And the effort of Nahda to reach out to secularists and to address the concerns by embracing in a more serious way than the Islamists in Egypt have a consensus-based notion of political decision-making. By the way, I'm not arguing for a consensus-based notion of democracy, but in a critical phase of a transition, particularly when it comes to the constitutional process, consensus is absolutely critical. You can't base the constitutional process on majority rule. Everybody must feel that somehow their interests are protected. This is what we call, in the language of political science, a contingent institutional compromise or a political pact. It's absolutely essential. And Nahda understood this, and even as when the negotiations seemed to go to the brink in Tunisia, that people stepped back, and this was very encouraging. And you had, as a result of the elections, the creation of what was called the Troika, Nahda with two secular or non-Islamist parties coming together and then presiding over this effort to write a constitution. What has happened in Tunisia, however, has been the entrance of the Salafists into the political game. Now, in the case of, we know that in Egypt, the entrance of the Salafists is also critical, because the Salafists plus the Justice and Freedom Party got 65 or 70% of the seats. And on the basis of this extraordinary victory and the isolation and marginalization of secular and leftist forces, they created a constituent assembly based largely on that division, and that scared the bejesus out of the secularists, and they began to exit out of the whole constitution writing process. Nahda has not tried to do that. Nahda has been much more inclusive, but the rise of the Salafists, who were not included in the political game, didn't have a political party in the beginning, don't have formal representation in the parliament, which I think is unfortunate, by the way. The rise of the Salafists has really tended to escalate the secular Islamist divide, and what we have is fundamentalists on the secular and Islamist side clashing in the streets. And the worrisome problem there is not only the violence in the streets and the increasing difficulty in the constitution writing process, particularly the polarization over the question of Sharia, which 2 months ago nobody would have predicted that. 3 months ago, 2 months ago, everybody was saying this is not going to be an issue The Constitution, we all agree, is the civil state. Islam provides the religious heritage, blah, 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 but nobody was talking about a Sharia sort of constitution or inserting. Then the Nakhta party began to toy with that idea. They stepped back, by the way. Ghanouchi said they're not going to do that, but that already it dallied enough such that it scared the secularists, and then they mobilized in the streets, and they got their fundamentalists out there, and the other fundamentalists came. Suddenly, Ghanouchi and his party are faced with the need to resort to the police and the very sort of apparatus that they wanted to isolate and depoliticize, or certainly to isolate. And so we have an increasingly difficult situation, made worse in the case of Tunisia by the fact that the constitution writing process coincides with essentially a long drawn-out electoral cycle in which the various political groups are getting ready for the next parliamentary elections after the Constitution is written. That is a really bad mix. I mean, constitutional experts will tell you that constitution writing has to take place essentially by getting your 30 people together, putting them in a room like this, locking the door, coming up with a constitution, going out 2 months later, having consultations, but have some degree of autonomy to engage in a process that's not continuously politicized. This is what we mean in that sense by rule of law. In this particular case, the convergence of constitution writing with what is preparations for a round of elections to go after the Constitution is written has really exacerbated the secular Islamist divide against the background of economic crisis, the rise of the Salafists, and so on. All of this is by way of saying that if we think that we can explain any of these outcomes by something called Islam, whatever that means, I don't think we can. It's not as if it's unimportant. I mean, it is important. One of the interesting aspects of the rise of, or the coming to political power of Ghanouchi and the Nakhta party is that the leadership tends to be more moderate than the base. You have a lot of young people very unhappy with the economic situation, very drawn to the Salafist, jihadist sort of ideology, have very little experience in what Islam is all about as a doctrine or as a faith, and are very drawn into this politicized extreme version of Islamism. That has now come to Indonesia and to Tunisia as a consequence of the openness of the society now. And you have Salafists coming in from Egypt and doing tours all over the country and drawing large crowds. You had a regional Salafist convention 4 weeks ago in Tunis that brought these guys from all over the region. You have Tunisia as a way station from Europe of Salafists coming and jihadists from Europe to Tunisia to go to Syria to fight in the war against the Alawite regime. And suddenly the Ghanouchi regime the government finds itself involved in a very different kind of situation. And the kind of Islamism of Ghanouchi, which was very much affected by his time overseas and living in England and his effort to provide a kind of synthetic, syncretic, liberal sort of vision of Islam, is much harder to sustain under these conditions in which the base of the movement is increasingly attracted by a much more radical version of Islam. And so what we're really talking about is ideology, political context, incentives, governmental structures, and the whole myriad of factors that do or do not create the mechanism by which these sorts of identity conflicts can be resolved peacefully, as opposed to violently. Because the problem ultimately, and we see it in Egypt today, is that if the non-Islamists, I prefer the term non-Islamists, because the term secularist is very inaccurate. By non-Islamists, I mean political actors who don't necessarily want Islam to be the basis of some sort of political program. In Egypt today, the non-Islamists have gone to the courts to essentially undermine and delegitimate the election of this new constitutional assembly. And they've done so with the implicit support of perhaps elements of the military, elements within the court itself, leaders from Al-Azhar, interestingly enough, and clearly secular liberal intellectuals who see this as their last stand. And under those conditions, there could either be a basis for an increased internal conflict in Egypt, or for a decision by the military to step in and reimpose order from above. I don't think it's very likely at this point, because the decision that came today in Egypt was the decision of the administrative court. The Supreme Constitutional Court is yet to rule, and that really will be the critical ruling that will count in that regard. But if they rule against the Constituent Assembly, then we're back to rejiggering this whole process or starting it again? How are we going to create and there's another court case that is questioning the very legitimacy of the elections itself and the interim government that has been created, or interim parliament that has been created. So this is a consequence of the fact that ultimately what has happened is that the Islamists in Egypt, feeling encouraged by their considerable victory, have decided to do precisely what they promised they wouldn't do in the beginning, which is essentially go for a more hegemonic government in which the non-Islamist forces have reason to fear that they will be politically and socially excluded as a consequence of democratization itself. And the decision by the Muslim Brethren to run a presidential candidate, for example, to offer only 25 or 30 seats to non-Islamist candidates in the Constitutional Assembly, all suggests that the Muslim Brethren has, in some sense, been perhaps seduced by its own sudden victory and is losing sight of what's really necessary, and that is to guarantee to those who have most reason to fear democracy that they have nothing to fear. You've really got to make that clear, and you've got to reach out. And that is not what has been happening. Of course, the Muslim Brethren in Egypt decided to add 10 non-Islamist voices to the Constituent Assembly from 30 to 40 the other day. But those kinds of lessons can't be learned too late. If you learn them too late and there's already enough fear that has been encouraged, then it's sometimes very difficult to put the cat back in the hat, or whatever the proper expression is. And that's where I think Egypt is today. I mean, one has reason to be concerned. So I'll leave it at that and be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.